I'm really happy to be here with Mzwan, the campaign manager for the Rethinking Accounting initiative, which is a really exciting new initiative around accountancy education, rethinking how we do accounting, how we teach accounting in practice. Could you tell us a bit more, Mzwan, of what got you involved in this project and what the main aims are of the project in terms of what you're trying to achieve?
Yeah. Thanks a lot, James, for actually also having us as part of your ongoing work as well to sort of like discuss with various people, young and old, in the accountancy profession. I got involved with rethinking work when I was still in university back in South Africa, and we got introduced in sort of like, well, I was an active student on campus, and then I was an economics student, and we wanted to change the syllabus, so to speak, transform the syllabus to speak to a whole lot more of the real issues that we felt like the economics in the classroom was not reflective of the South African context and the global context in general, insofar as the real world was concerned. And we also campaigned around decolonizing the curriculum as well. So when I got into the UK, I sort of like got in touch with the Rethinking Economics International, and they were beginning to have this exploratory project of thinking whether we rethink the entire education system or we rethink some things in the education. And they wanted to see if there was an appetite, whether in the academy or in the profession, whether we to rethink accounting and accountancy. So that's how I got involved. So I got in touch with the guys, and that was the idea to say, what are the challenges in the accounting? Of course, we do know the challenges, but are they really challenges? And there is then appreciation of this. And we're often making a contrast as the work is continuing with economics. For instance, the economics discipline did not necessarily think that there was something wrong with what we're teaching, even how we're teaching it, you know. And the contrast is that when you speak with accounting academics and you're speaking with the professionals, they think so many things are wrong with what is being taught and how it's taught and what's happening in practice.
Yeah, and this is all that tied up with all the structures we have in academia, so it's really hard to like publish high quality, ranking journals in economics that are more kind of heterodox. So it's kind of rethinking some of the structures, how we deliver this stuff. So people might have heard of kind of heterodox heterodox economics and rethinking economics. So where did the rethinking accountancy bit come in? Because that's a bit more recent, am I right?
Yes. The rethinking accountancy started last year, September. And as I've said, just as an exploratory project. And like you say, so in the difference between economics and accounting is that accounting is a profession, whereas economics is a discipline. So you've got this idea of heterodox economics or orthodox economics and so many schools of different thinking, okay? And you don't necessarily have so much of that with accounting. I mean, you do have now recently ideas around critical accounting, ideas around sustainable accounting, around things such as ESGs and stuff like that. But that's like very recent developments in accounting and even that, it's not to say that we are different in our thinking, but it's to say what has been lacking in our thinking or in our doing, So that's also the differences. And that's what really gave rise to rethinking accountancy, to say, within the profession and the frameworks of the profession, obviously, and how it's regulated and accredited, to say, obviously, if I want to be an accountant, depending on where you are in the world, you have to write certain accredited exams, a certain amount of those exams, and then you can be said to be a chartered accountant, and you must affiliate with an accreditation body and be an accredited professional, and then work and finish certain hours of training and stuff like that. So it's quite very narrow and stringent and quite specific and technical in the way of how you become an accountant. So even at a business school, it's not a dialogical subject. It's quite a very technical subject and very focused on efficiency and supposedly doing things right. You've got to make sure that you read well the statements, you translate
understand
them
it.
well into the money, then you present them well, you stress test the models well, and all of that stuff, and then advisory work, how do you report, how do you advise, and stuff like that. So that's very much different to economics, because there the thinking is very vast and plural. I think that's what ended up being the terminology, for instance, around the rethinkers of economics. It was about the idea that there must be pluralism in thinking and in doing. Whereas you wouldn't necessarily call for pluralism in accountancy, but you would call for these things that we call it for instance, such as ethics, such as sustainability, environmental as well as social responsiveness. Yeah.
Well, maybe one of the things that's common across the sort of mainstream of accounting research and like the kind of mainstream orthodox neoclassical economics is this idea you can measure something and it'll be right, it'll be true and fair, whereas actually the accounting is often very active in terms of, like you mentioned, on sustainability reporting. You can think of like so many other areas, like the value of kind of public investment, of health investment, what are the outcomes, what's the value for money. So yeah, rethinking all of that's really important. What's your view in terms of, because I think you touched a bit in your response there on maybe the tension between we learn the rules because it's a vocation versus we have maybe more a critical perspective on kind of how accounting works and changes the world and so on. Are you focusing more on influencing the profession, or are you looking more at kind of academic syllabuses, or what do you think needs to sort of change through rethinking accounting?
And you can help me with that. You can help me with that. And I say so because we have to think about how ideas form. So it's an ideological question in a sense to appreciate whether an education system has got the requisite power to change how people behave. For an example, if we say that accounting firms commit fraud on a frequent basis and fraud is wrong, is it because of how we taught them? Have we taught them to be good committers of fraud or enablers of crimes, financial crimes? Or this has nothing to do with what they are taught? They probably are taught many ethics, they have social, environmental, religious, and so forth ethics. You could argue that ethics are fundamental in the accounting curriculum, and there would be no causality in that regard. And this perhaps is something that has to do with the profession, And then you go into the profession. What are the checks and balances in our preparation, in our auditing systems, in our reporting systems that enable fraud? And then that would be able to direct us into say that perhaps we need to do education with the appreciation that professional practices will change, or we advocate for professional practices to change with the understanding that that will also change the education. To be quite honest with you, I think that there are distinct challenges in both.
Yeah.
For instance, when you engage academics, there are challenges with the absence of critical and sustainable accountants and others, and just the fact that they are often prescribed to by the accreditation bodies, so ICAWA, CCA, CIMA, and stuff like that, who in a way tell them that if your students need to hold a certain qualification and accreditation, then they need to do these courses and they need to do them like this, and so on and so on. And academics simply don't want that. Students on the other side find it very difficult that they're in this constrained environment where things are set and how they should do them. But if you go into the profession, you may not necessarily find a situation where they feel like they're so constrained into, of course, auditing, people don't want to be in auditing because it's a lot of work and too much of checks and balances and stuff like that. People don't want. People, when they get to their work environment, they want a more dynamic space that's more agile, that's more flexible, that can sort of like speaks to even a lot of what they do themselves. But maybe one of the motivations to go into the space is to make money, and somewhat they then find these ways of incentivizing themselves, and that may lead to the ethical challenges that we see. So in short, to answer your question, it would depend on where we think the problem is. Is it in the profession or is it in the education, and how do the two relate?
Yes, and you said it's kind of an exploratory project. You set it up quite recently in September, Rethinking Accounting, and part of the aim is, I guess, to understand these problems and use it as a vehicle that then educators can look to think about what can we learn, what can we draw into our syllabus to really, change behaviour. Because I think what you said about ethics is interesting, because a lot of the, auditors, for example, we learn the ethical standards, we learn the rules.
Until auditors cheat in the ethics exam.
Well, indeed, yeah. So there was exactly how ironic.
You're like, what? So they cheated on not on the computer technical or professional development exam, the ethical exam. They were unethical. You're like, what?
So that really brings out this contradiction, doesn't it, between learning the rules and actually changing behaviour. So it's not just about learning what the ethical standard says. It's looking at audit failure. It's looking at what the role of the accounting firms in society. Could I ask you a bit more? So in terms of setting up the project, you're working with some fantastic people. You've got Joan Valentine, Adam Lever, a colleague of mine from Sheffield, Atul Shah, and others. And I know Atul spoke very passionately about decolonising the curriculum, about diversity in academia and the profession. What's it been like to work with those guys?
It's actually interesting that leads to this, because you were speaking about the behaviour in audit and the people in general, and how people can be more ethical in a way, or how their behavior can change. One of the interesting questions that I think many professionals need to ask themselves is what I do resemble in any way my own personal ethics? And this brings well with the idea that with the people that we're working with, because fundamentally it's a cultural change, so you're speaking about the decolonization things and the culture, it's a culture that you find in the Big Four, in the accounting firms, that may speak to the lack of ethics. So sometimes it may not be that your religion or your culture or your background or your traditions and norms may allow you to commit fraud, but the culture in the workspace that is not enabling you to be fully cultural in yourself. And you've got this Western, global North kind of way of efficiency. More especially you find that in the US. If you speak to the colleagues in the US, they'll tell you that it's very technical, very impersonal. We're not in any way culturalized in the way that speaks to our own value systems, with our own ethics, with our own religions and our own backgrounds and diversity, and drawing strength from that. So, like you're saying, Atul is very passionate about that. To say that you have to change the culture. Adam Lever, John as well. John gives a very interesting and rich history of accounting and how it has changed from what would have been conceptualized as a social concept, and has become such a technical, complex, hide-and-seek game that no one needs to know what we're doing, and those are quite passionate people who actually really want to come up with alternatives to accounting profession and work, and broaden the work of accountants and the people in the financial services to ethical considerations, environmental and social, and appreciating the diversity, the inclusion, and speaking to many other challenges that you find yourselves in, which you would. And I find working with them quite very interesting and exciting, because you would hardly find academics who would be interested in this kind of things, who would who'd want to broaden the scope of the work and want to contribute in that meaningful set. As you would understand, academics usually like to just do their own work and just be on their own lane and like, no, I'm just contributing when there's some good, So I think they've been quite passionate and very engaged in creating alternatives.
Yeah. So kind of opening up the accounts. That's really interesting. I think this point about diversity there's a lot to be said about that, isn't there? I know because I used to work in PwC, one of the big four. There's all sorts of problems in terms of this big gender pay gap. There's very sort of white male dominance at the partner level. Older white male, yeah, exactly. So that we talk about diversity, it's not just I don't know what the word is. It's also about how you change the culture of the firm. It's not just about equality of numbers. All those cultural issues play into it. And that sort of leads into, like you're saying, like cultural issues. There's a culture of kind of not just fraud, but you think about audit failure, tax avoidance.
And speaking of culture, the club culture, the Paris, Boston, London, UK, New York clubs, of this very select few people who really are enablers of wrongdoing. And one of the sad things, and maybe it probably would come out in your work because you do also talk to young people who obviously may aspire to be partners, so many ethical challenges that they confront as they have to do that. And a huge part of accounting work, for instance, is advisory. So you do a lot of advisory work in terms of auditing as well, and tax and stuff like that. And often there's this idea where young people that are involved on a day-to-day client basis don't want to upset the clients because they won't be retained, and you work very hard to retain the client. In fact, to get more clients so that you make more money for the company, but at what cost? What happens in the process of making sure that you retain the company, the client? So incentives are large, and there's an economic concept, for instance, how do we incentivize and disincentivize people in the space for good and bad doing, it's a big challenge, and it speaks to the culture, And like you're saying, one of the fundamentals, for instance, we really believe in rethinking is democratization. Democratize the spaces. It mustn't be this monoculture, homogeneous and homogenic ideals of a select few, but appreciate the thinking from the global south, appreciate the thinking from women, appreciate the thinking from differently abled people, and different ideas that emerge, cultural, religious, and ethnicity, because the lack of diversity, in many ways, would have led to the challenges, ethical challenges, and the fraudulent scandals that we see, and the financial crimes that we see, and the huge illicit financial flows that we see, because there isn't an appreciation of who we are and our value proposition into the companies, and how the work that we do affects the communities that we live around and the people we live around, and the environment as well.
Yeah. And it is young people, like people who may be watching this podcast might not realise, but the accountancy profession, a lot of people leave shortly after the training contracts are completed. The vast majority of audit work, tax work, consultancy work will be done by people in the sort of 21 to 25-year-old age bracket. It is young people, and it's that thing about education, and there's a lot of diversity in the sense of like junior auditors from all backgrounds will join the firms, but then it's also about culture, reproduction, and ultimately who makes it up through the ranks. And that seems to be where you get these kind of cultures you're talking about reproducing themselves, and that's what we've really got to challenge, isn't it?
And I think we really have not, as the people, not appreciated the traumas that people go through in the workspaces, let alone the I mean, it's a huge, big problem, the pay gaps that you were talking about. But just in terms of progression and development, and what people have to do to develop, this vagueness in the culture as well, because no one wants to create that inclusive, diverse group where really there's an appreciation of diversity. So people, like you say, young people come into the workspace. They are 23 up to their 30, early 30s and developing themselves. But because as a young woman or as a differently abled person, who this space does not cater at all for your own, for you as a person, you sort of have to wear different hats, as a young person or woman who is sitting in a table like this and you are doing audit for a certain client, and you just have 4 white males and you are just probably the only woman or one black woman, it makes it even worse, to even release your potential in that space. And that color is not necessarily what you may find the problem, but it's the culture that you may find to be a problem, to say, do we have an appreciation, of this? Recently had a friend who has started working in some law firm in London, and the culture issue was a problem. And interestingly, the partner comes and says, I can appreciate that you may be struggling with the culture, and we're working on our diversity. And we discussed, it would have been a different conversation if when I came to join the company, you actually said, you know what, we have a culture problem. If you are finding issues, bring it up. Or if there's any ways we can do better, please bring it up. Because you actually never know when is the right time for you to speak. So most of the time, you're going to spend the time nodding. Yeah. They don't look like me. They don't talk like me. We share nothing in common. We don't eat the same food. We obviously, you are told at work you don't talk about race, culture, religion, and politics. Yeah. So you can't sort of be in a safe environment where even your intellectual prowess sort of what's the word? Thrives. Yeah. So you can't sort of thrive because you also have your guard up, you're quite guarded because you don't know. If you say something, you may be out the first cycle.
Because one thing some of the participants in a research project I'm working on at the moment have said to me is nobody wants to be the one who finds the audit issue. Nobody wants to be the one who sort of, I guess from a tax point of view, says, or maybe we shouldn't take this client. So it kind of feeds into that, doesn't it? If you're already feeling like you don't relate to people in the workplace because all the people at manager and above are very different from you culturally, how can you be expected to be the one?
And they don't say it, that we're different. Sometimes I sit in committees and I'm like, oh no, we don't have women here. It's the accountability as well that we need to bring into the work we do as ourselves as well. Obviously if we're sitting here as 5 guys, it's probably not going to occur to any of us that actually we don't have women here, we don't have younger person and stuff like that. So we have to say, no guys, we can't actually have this committee. We probably need to have more women here. And it doesn't happen. In fact, what you are saying now, in terms of tax, we can't take this client, how much, or rather, why does so much fraud go unspoken about? Where you have got forensic auditors, where you've got technical auditors and stuff like that, but so much fraud goes without being noticed. Truth of the matter is that many people don't want to say that this may be problematic because they know how big the client is, they know how important the client is.
People used to talk about the audit rug. You sweep things under the audit rug and nobody wants to look under the rug.
And then people are going to say, remember, we're not trying to present a perfect audit report. We're presenting a reasonable
Yes.
You see?
Yeah, so there's these qualifiers.
Yeah, there's qualifiers. So, but we picked it up. We just put it in the appendix. We have to call ourselves to order. We have to call ourselves to order and say, no, we want to, that we need to be able to flag things, and correct wrongdoing and say, no, this is an exploitation. In fact, while at that, there are people who do a lot of research around, for instance, the weaknesses of the laws, like, for instance, around tax particularly, and how some certain laws and tax regulations enable tax evasion and evasion. So there's no accountability. They're like, no. Our job is not to hold the client accountable. Who does? Please tell me.
Yeah,
who holds the account?
So sometimes we talk about the expectations gap and the idea that the public expectation is not the same as the legal requirements, but maybe we need to shift those requirements and shift the cultures in the firms that they are more proactively, ethically responsible. And what you're saying about how diversity is so integrated into that and inseparable from that, I think, is really important as well.
And account, and be accountable to ourselves, to our friends, to our colleagues, and therefore to our companies and to our communities, and be accountable. It was really, really, James, lacking and becoming thinner and thinner, and because, for instance, I think I was talking with, I think it might have been John, talking about how, or Susan, looking about how before that paper they used to publish of accountants that have been fined and not allowed to practice, people used to look forward to that, to see who has been kicked out, and you don't have those things as robust anymore, but the crimes, the financial crimes, the frauds and stuff like that have become more and more. And another thing perhaps we're not even talking about yet here is the integration of systems and the so-called fourth industrial revolution, and how the synchronization of new systems can make the work even harder of holding people accountable. It also does speak to why a lot of this has happened. Obviously, it has helped to detect a lot of those things, but at the same time, it could also enable the hiding of these things, because the systems have become so integrated and so complex. And data science really speaks to a lot of things that we at least cannot easily explain to people, or people understand and see. So we have to also think about the role that technology is going to play. And a lot of people are asking themselves, actually, that are in audit, that are in tax and stuff like that. What is the future of accounting? Talk about an auditor in future. How do they look like?
Yeah. What does it look like in 30 years?
In 30 years.
20 years.
It's hard
to say.
What will they be doing? And where and how? Are we probably going to have to imagine a lot of things? And we should start now. And that's why I think that's what our work is calling for. To say, we certainly have to sort of like change and stop being enablers of wrong and ethical doing, and be agents of positive change and contribute meaningfully and sustainably to our communities and our environment. Because certainly technology will change a lot of the work that we do as accountants.
Yeah.
And our work may need to be more critical.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe on the positive side, that can help us to have a fuller account of all of the impacts that businesses have on the environment, on society, and thinking about how we can rethink how we hold them accountable.
Yeah.
In terms of moving forward with the Rethinking Accounting network, what are your next steps and what are you looking at the moment?
So we've had very interesting response from a whole lot of people. I probably spend a lot of time now in doing emails and talking to people just because of how interested people are. Writing up alternatives, thinking articles and stuff like that, engaging really, which is good. It's good. Where to from now on? In our last meeting, for instance, we were just last week, we were talking about then going on a world project where we're going to study the principles of accounting, really, which is shared in many business schools as Accounting 101. Like, what do you get to the School of Accounting and do? And obviously, as a foundational work, we want to see what is it in the foundation that can change, to ultimately change the entire outlook of the profession, So we will be hosting a lot of workshops with the different academics and a lot of people that have been doing this work and the professionals. We have been engaging the accreditation bodies, ICAW, CIMA. CIMA very excited about shifting to more ethical, more sustainable type of work, trying to bring in more new systems into work. So that, I think, is what's going to define the next year, to do workshops and writing up the alternatives to introduce into the system, and having a lot more of the accreditation bodies as well as the business schools to rethink. And we will probably be engaging more of the accountancy firm, the Big Four, to see what systems are being put in place to foster accountability. Maybe the government as well, to see how we can differently legislate on tax, and what has been our role in allowing these things to happen. For instance, people do get fined, but it's just fines, like Deloitte will pay £200,000 or £500 million for audit failure or audit scandal. But no one, and then sometimes lie and say the partners will resign, but people still, even if they do resign, sometimes they take big, fat, lifetime, evergreen retirement packages. No, that's not
that, and that's something that could be looked at much more closely, I think, because these fines have been quite a recent phenomenon through the FRC. In the last 5 years or so, they've started fining the firms, and they're under a lot of scrutiny, aren't they? Possibly, we might have a new regulator in the UK, we might not, we don't know. But brilliant, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for
Thank you so much for this conversation. It really is helpful. Thank you so much for the platform.